Science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. Hi, I'm Juliette Selgren, and this is my podcast, The Great Antidote. Named for Adam Smith, brought to you by Liberty Fund. To learn more, visit www.adamsmithworks.org. Welcome back. Today, on May 25th, 2023, we're going to be talking about trade and some of the trade policies of our most recent presidents. Christine McDaniel is coming on to talk about this, and I'm so excited. She is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Her research focuses on international trade, globalization, and intellectual property rights. Welcome on.
Thank you, Juliet. Great to be here.
So, before we get into trade, what is the most important thing that people my age or in my generation should know that we don't?
The most important thing people in your generation should know that you might not. I would think that would be that the net benefits of the government trying to protect domestic workers and producers from import competition are much smaller than the net costs of doing that. And while it might sound great to really anybody, on the street, hey, the government's going to, help protect you from, import competition. The net effects are negative, right? So it might help a small group of people, but the cost on everybody else is so much greater. And, just for instance, when the U.S. put steel tariffs on during the last administration, it did help a few U.S. steel companies, right? But there were higher costs for all the companies, U.S. companies, small, medium-sized, large companies in the U.S. that use steel to make, auto parts or cutlery or manufacturing equipment. They all had to pay higher prices, and that means that they didn't have, as much revenues, net revenues to reinvest back in the company, to put back into their workers, to hire more workers. Not to mention, they were less competitive in the U.S. and abroad because they're competing with people who do have access to globally priced inputs, right? And then there's these studies out there that show something like each steel job saved in the U.S. because the tariffs cost Americans about $650,000 per job. So be leery when you hear of politicians promising to protect you from imports.
Let's get right into it. I mean, we're already kind of in it. Donald Trump's presidential bid was grounded in an anti-globalization platform, some of what you were already talking about, that included reviving American manufacturing jobs in steel and all of that, and saving the middle class from extinction, with a special focus on cracking down on China. In office, he attacked the multilateral trading system that was built after World War II and unilaterally imposed tariffs on American purchases of steel, as you were mentioning, and redesigned NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which we'll get into shortly. And then he killed the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's a lot of stuff that was done. He also refused to appoint new members to the WTO, the World Trade Organization's appellate body, which rendered the World Trade Organization's dispute resolution mechanism entirely defunct. He went to economic war with our allies and close trading partners in the name of America First. Just some information. So how much of a break from our previous approach to trade were President Trump's policies and kind of this new, maybe not new, narrative?
So I think there is something. There was this one quote a friend of mine said. Can I swear on this podcast?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not a swearer, by the way. And if my kids are listening to this, I'm only quoting somebody else. But somebody once said about President Trump, yeah, he's an asshole, but he's our asshole. And I do think that appealed to a lot of people, that sort of that outlook. And it does kind of feel good to have someone, who says they're going to stand up for you and get a better deal for you and all this. But as everything, the devil's in the details. And what really that meant was just a whole bunch of tariffs that were placed, basically more taxes on U.S. imports, and then other countries retaliated. And then, of course, that meant, U.S. exporters were faced with, those tariffs on their goods when they were trying to sell abroad. So, and then that just boomeranged right back into the U.S. economy in a very bad way. So, I would also, remind people that while President Trump move to, on the WTO appellate body membership was sort of the final nail in that coffin, at least for now. He wasn't the first to put that nail in. So it actually began with, during the Bush administration, Bush 43, this discussion started about how the appellate body was interpreting particular rules in the WTO in ways that were not necessarily intended to be. And there were some allegations that the appellate body went above and beyond what was in the text, and in a way that gave China a lot more room to subsidize and more leeway on its state control of its economy. And then President Obama, his team decided not to renew the appellate body member, and then and so Trump just really kind of continued with that, but because of the timing, it became sort of paralyzed under the Trump administration. But his administration definitely wasn't the first to voice these concerns.
Because I haven't actually done a lot of this on the podcast. Oh, excuse me. I was wondering if you could give us kind of a brief overview of the WTO and its role in trade and America in relationship to that. Just to, I don't know, get a more generalized understanding of how important this is.
Well, so, trade economists think trade is really very, very important. But in the big picture, trade is, it's less than 20% of GDP, far less. But that's largely because the U.S. is such a big economy. But the about half of the U.S. trade is business to business trade. So small, medium, large size businesses depend on the ability to access intermediate inputs, components they need to make their things. They want to be able to buy the best quality, the best price, and that might be the company down the street, but it also might be the company in a different country, right? And so it's one of those things where you don't really realize how important it is until it's gone or until it's really hard to do. And that's why when we saw the tariffs go on, there were thousands and thousands of U.S. companies that were complaining, asking if they could get, an exclusion from those tariffs. So trade, it affects every single worker, every single company in the United States, either directly or indirectly. just look around you, something that you're probably holding in your hand or looking at may have been designed in one country but made in another. If you're holding a smartphone, for instance, your iPhone, that was designed in California but assembled in China, right? So the ways that trade affect our lives every day, are from when you wake up in the morning to in terms of what you have for breakfast, your coffee, those ingredients are more likely than not to come from abroad. The clothes you wear, the cars you drive, it truly is a global economy we're living in. And you can see this in everything that you eat and consume and use and do throughout the day.
And what is the WTO's role in that? How does the WTO influence global trade?
Well, so the WTO, the World Trade Organization, is a member-driven organization, and it was a chance for countries to come together in the mid-90s and commit to really clear rules on reciprocity. So in terms of if you cut your trade barriers for me, I'll cut my trade barriers for you. And then we commit to this, and we also say to each other, if one of us breaks these rules, then we're okay with the rule breaker getting kind of sued in court, if you will, and that's where the dispute settlement mechanism comes in the WTO. Before the WTO, we just had the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and that was really huge right after World War II, as you were saying in the beginning, Juliet, and that was really the first major international agreement in terms of trade, in terms of countries committing to lower tariffs through reciprocity, which is really brilliant when you think of it, right? Because how can you get countries to agree to lower their barriers? Well, economists will tell you, it doesn't matter what the other country's doing, you should lower your barriers. And on paper, that's definitely true, but in practice, we don't see a lot of countries doing that. In practice, we see a lot of negotiations, and so the GATT was a real movement forward in terms of reciprocity. And then the WTO brought in a lot more to that, right? So not just tariffs, but a lot of non-tariff barriers, quotas, in terms on agriculture, rules on subsidies, rules. There was a whole chapter on subsidies around large civil aircraft, Boeing and Airbus. A whole chapter on agriculture, a chapter on services. So the WTO not only locked in the tariff commitments, but a lot of non-tariff commitments. And then the two big principles the WTO hinges on is one is called the most favored nations principle. That is, you can't treat any imports from one country better or worse than you treat any imports from another country, unless you have a real legitimate trade agreement with them. So there's that. Number one. Number two is something called the national treatment principle, and that is you can't treat domestically produced goods any better than you treat imported goods, right? Or you can't treat imports any worse than you treat domestically produced goods. So basically, it just tries to level set everything, right? In terms of all your trading partners are on level ground, and then also your domestic products, goods and services are on level ground with imported goods and services, at least to the extent the agreement covers that. So it's a nice it's kind of democratizes trade in a way. Someone said that once. I guess it makes a lot of sense if you think about it's with WTO, all countries are on the same level. Big countries don't hold any more power than small countries. Might doesn't really make right under WTO rules because everybody agreed to those rules, and everybody is open to getting sued if they don't follow the rules.
Huh. Thank you for that exposing and comprehensive explanation. So back to Trump a little bit now. Has he achieved his policy objectives? And I guess what have the consequences been, if not, or if yes?
The consequences of Trump in terms of trade?
Yeah, of his policies. Did the things he passed meet their objectives or not? And what happened as a consequence?
Well, so one thing he did a lot in terms of on trade. One thing he did is he withdrew the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a trading bloc between almost a dozen countries in the Pacific that did not include China, and that agreement was seen as a real opportunity for the U.S. to write the rules on trade, especially with our Pacific trading partners, and not China write the rules on trade, right? So the WTO goes only so far, right? There's a lot of room to modernize our trading rules. And it's really hard to do this in the WTO because you need all 164 countries to agree. So we haven't had a WTO agreement in a really, really, really long time. But at the same time, there's lots of countries that are ready to do more liberalization or want to get more clarity and transparency on key issues, like, for instance, e-commerce, right? Or the role of state-owned enterprises, and so what the Trans-Pacific Partnership was an opportunity to get more transparency and more clarity and more openness commitments on digital trade, e-commerce, and for countries to understand or kind of agree to what they could and could not do in terms of state-run or state-owned companies. And yeah, it was really major in terms of those rules and rule setting in terms of the Pacific. A little bit more market access, but I think the TPP was more about the trade rules than it was about market access. There's some market access in there, but it wasn't groundbreaking, except for Japan in agriculture. So when he pulled us out of TPP, that was huge. And then, and that was a big loss to, especially U.S. agriculture, because the extra market access that they were going to get, especially in Japan and Vietnam, was quite notable. So, but the Trump administration realized this, and they did a deal with Japan, and they did get Japan to open up their ag market to the U.S. to the extent that would have happened through the TPP. And there's actually a wild backstory to that we can talk about if you want. But so anyway, it was sort of like 2 steps back, 1 step forward, I think, on the Trump and TPP thing. But the thing is, Australia and Japan are quietly leading the way on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's now called the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. But those countries are still moving forward with that, and so in a lot of ways, our goals are still being met there. We're just not at the table, and it's not being done exactly the way we would have done it. But I think big picture, the fact that there are a lot of countries in the Pacific who are agreeing with these rules, that the U.S. had a big hand in writing, not China. That goal is something accomplished. Another thing Trump did is, of course, the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs. I'll never forget that day in the office. He held a live press conference, the White House, or was it the Eisenhower building? But live press conference, had all the steel CEOs there, and announced he was doing 25% steel tariffs, and then also 7.5 or 15% on aluminum, and he was doing that in the name of national security. And that was I think a real game changer in terms of international trade rules, because that is a real big no-no to do in the WTO. You only invoke national security concerns if you have a very strong legitimate case. It's not something to be taken lightly, given that the U.S. steel industry is so politically influential in Washington and already, quote unquote, enjoys so much protectionism from imports. The fact that he was doing this for steel was quite suspect. And also, the Secretary of Defense at the time had publicly stated that those tariffs were not even needed for U.S. national security. So the case was pretty weak on national security grounds, to the extent public information is available and experts in the area have spoken about it. But and of course, other countries took the U.S. to the WTO over that. We lost the case, and then the WTO. The U.S. basically said, "Well, we're going to go ahead with it anyway." And by the way, you shouldn't tell us what to do in national security. So this, I think, will really be remembered as a time where the U.S., maybe you could say abused that particular national security provision in the WTO, and now opens the door for other countries to do so as well. Because what's to stop other countries from saying, "Oh, yeah, those blue widgets we import, well, they're a national security threat, and we're now imposing 25% tariffs on them," or pick a product, right? So I think that's a pretty big legacy he left. And then right after those big tariffs, because those tariffs were on all U.S. imports, what he did is said, "Oh, well, now we're going to do these deals. So whoever wants to do a deal with U.S., let's talk." And so the EU carved out a deal. South Korea carved out a deal. Japan carved out a deal. Australia, they actually got off scot-free somehow. And so it was a lot of different deal making in the background, which really does go against the WTO principle of treat everybody the same.
So one thing that seems pretty clear is that Trump effectively made but I meant to say protectionism popular again. So now that there's President Biden, the new sheriff in town, have things changed? How do you compare their approaches?
The actual policies haven't changed, but the tone that by which they're delivered has changed. I think in a lot of ways, it's Biden's trade policy. It's like Trump wine in a Biden bottle. It's really the same thing, but it just has different packaging. So it really hasn't changed. If anything, Biden has just taken it even further in terms of even more tariffs and even more provisions that make it harder to import.
So then, how do you assess the impact of Trump's tariffs on China and other countries on our economy and our consumers? And I guess this is still happening with Biden. So should he keep them, remove them, or modify them?
Well, now what's happened is that there are some legitimate national security issues that have emerged, and I mean, they were always there, but they've gotten much bigger, over the past 5-10 years. And now these legitimate national security issues are getting kind of mixed up with veiled calls, with protectionism. And that's one thing that Republicans and Democrats agree on is the quote unquote China threat. And so, we're seeing a lot of efforts to, or calls for protectionism measures, but in the name of national security, right? And so, while Biden is still continuing with, the China tariffs, for instance, and the steel and aluminum tariffs, it's easier now to make or just claim that there's a national security case for it. A lot easier to do that today than it would have been, 10, 15, 20 years ago. So, Biden's still doing it, but kind of dressing it up as a national security / addressing the China threat response. And that seems to be pretty popular with this Congress and the American public at the moment. But in terms of, how it's affecting the U.S., well, tariffs are one of those things where one way to think about this is death by 1,000 cuts, right? Because every time there's a new tariff on U.S. imports, it either hits you at the checkout aisle or it hurts the U.S. economy in terms of U.S. companies now have to pay a higher price to get what they need to make what they make, right? And so all those import taxes make U.S. manufacturers' costs go up. They make U.S. manufacturers less competitive, both here and abroad, and they either will lose sales or they'll take the hit in the markup, right? And we do see this in the sectors where they've been more hit by tariffs, and but it's not like it's not a huge, significant overnight effect. It's something that slowly builds up. When we look at this in the data with rigorous methods, we disentangle the effects of the tariffs from everything else. We can see the effects in terms of higher producer prices. We also see the effects in terms of on U.S. jobs, because as firms take the hit on markup, they will pull back in other areas like employment, and then also on the retaliatory effects. Those U.S. companies that got hit by retaliatory tariffs did shrink their employment base. So that's how we're kind of seeing the bad side of this pile up for America.
And then I read a Peterson Institute study that noted that if we reduce tariffs, then inflation would actually decrease by a meaningful amount. Can you kind of explain that connection with us? Because I think that this relates to the death by 1,000 cuts, because it feels like inflation. Every time I go to check out, it's another cut.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So if you look at the price index for U.S. goods and you break it down by tradable goods and non-tradable goods, you see this huge difference in terms of U.S. tradable goods have experienced stark deflation over the years, while the non-tradable goods in the U.S. have experienced, a steady march of upward price movement. So what the tariffs do is, they reverse a little bit of that, and now they're putting a little bit more pressure on those prices of tradable goods. Reducing these tariffs will not solve the inflation issue at all, but it certainly wouldn't hurt, right? And I've seen some studies that show it might shave like maybe between 0.5 and 1.5 percentage points off. The most credible ones I've seen, it's probably less than 1 percentage point. But that doesn't mean just because it wouldn't solve it, we shouldn't do it, right? There's usually never just one solution to any problem. You have to do a lot of a lot of different things. And the inflation the U.S. economy is experiencing is due to a lot more than just the tariffs. But sure, I mean, cutting the tariffs definitely wouldn't hurt, and would actually help the lower income households the most, because they're the ones that spend a higher share of their paycheck on the goods that are getting hit by most of the tariffs.
So I guess obviously there's national security, but are there any sort of prospects for any comprehensive U.S.-China trade deal? And I guess what are the main areas of contention and cooperation between the two countries in terms of trade?
Well, a U.S.-China trade deal would be absolutely amazing in terms of the economics, right? Because you get so much more out of trade deals when you do them with countries that are very different from you. And just in terms of, and not to mention when you do them with larger countries, and China, just in terms of population, over 4 times the size, and in terms of economic makeup, they have abundance in labor, especially lower wage labor, and there's just a lot of room there for huge gains from trade. There's also a lot of room, though, for there would be some pretty big adjustment costs in the U.S. With trade, there's always going to be winners and losers, and but the U.S.-China trade, I mean, the U.S. economy has pretty much absorbed the brunt of the adjustment costs that we would be going through with China. So, there's obviously still a lot more areas there, but it's not so much about tariffs as it is the room for improvement is more in other areas like technology transfer rules, protecting intellectual property, protecting legitimate technology transfers, cybersecurity, and rules on state-owned enterprises. So I don't really see a U.S.-China trade deal in our future anytime soon, because the American public just does not have the stomach to really freely open up their market to a huge economy that is state-run and will subsidize companies for their own reasons that don't comport with the principles of reciprocity. It can be very disruptive, for other trading partners when you start to subsidize your own industries. So there's the economic and non-economic aspects of that potential U.S.-China trade deal. And then, did you say national security was the other question?
Well, I said kind of aside from national security, because obviously that plays into it, but that's we're running low on time, and I'd like to touch on some other things. In particular, so we've talked about China, but what about the U.S. and the EU, especially with all these subsidies? Like, what does that stage of trade look like?
The U.S. and the EU are, very strong, still very strong partners and allies in international trade. The U.S. and EU are starting to cooperate very closely on particular key sectors. For instance, remember those steel tariffs? Well, the EU came to the U.S., said, "Hey, can we sort out a deal here? We're not a target for you guys on why you put, we don't think our steel is a national security threat to you. So can we please work out a deal?" And so, yes, the U.S. and the EU worked out a deal, but they actually did more than that. They started writing their own rules on carbon intensity and the greenhouse gas emissions of the production process around steel. And so it's almost as if they're starting to kind of create their own trade bubble for steel. In other words, if you're inside this bubble and you can commit to making steel in an environmentally friendly way, and you can also commit to not doing X, Y, and Z, then we can have free trade in steel with each other, right? And so they're trying to get, I think the idea is to get other countries to join that group as well. So that's been kind of interesting to watch. For 40 years now, the United States and the Europeans have been trying to address a so-called overcapacity problem in the world steel market, and which is basically a result of some countries subsidizing their steel sector, and they haven't been able to do it. So this is kind of the EU and the US taking matters into their own hands and saying, well, we're going to go ahead and we're going to create this bubble with these rules, and whoever else wants to join, you can talk to us, right? So that's, I think, a space to watch. And then on technology, so with advanced technology and computer chips, the semi-monolithic integrated circuit, this is an area where increasingly can be used for military uses, and so countries want to make sure they are not putting a lot of effort into this high-tech stuff and then selling it to countries that will turn around and use it against them militarily, right? So there's been a number of new announcements against selling particular items, dual-use items, like high-tech items, to China and Russia. But that takes a lot of cooperation, and we're also seeing there a lot of cooperation between the United States and the European Union. So there's a lot of deep cooperation across the Atlantic, and it's been really kind of exciting to watch.
And then how about Canada and Mexico, right? So we had NAFTA, which was the force behind the creation of this remarkable North American supply chain. So I guess, what was NAFTA and what did it accomplish? And then what is the USMCA and how is it different from NAFTA, and how do you evaluate that?
Okay, so NAFTA was basically, before NAFTA, we had the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement, right? So NAFTA was basically just bringing Mexico into the U.S.-Canada free trade space. And it was a match made in heaven. I mean, you had, Mexico, very different economic makeup than Canada and the U.S. So Mexico could focus on certain parts of the supply chain. Canada and the U.S. could focus on other parts, and it was a win-win. It was a win-win conversation. I mean, a win-win economic partnership. The U.S. being so productive in agriculture, and now has Canada and Mexico as their number one export. They're very top export markets. So these three countries, just very close in terms of trade partnership, but then it also, more or less, and also in terms of how they see the role of the state and their commitment to openness. So we have seen, though, with this current Mexican government, a bit of a U-turn on some of that, which has been concerning. But all countries kind of go through their it kind of ebb and flow in their commitment to openness. just like the United States. So, but it's a constant, it's one of those things where, like, think of it like you're on a mountain, and if you're not trying to keep walking up, you're just going to kind of slide back down, right? So there's always going to be forces there to pull you back down. There's always going to be sectors, in the economy that feel like they need special protection, or they're trying to curry favors. And so governments are constantly trying to do this balancing act. And but overall, the North American trade and economic partnership is still very tight, very close, and it's so important to all three countries. You asked about the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. That's supposed to be an update of NAFTA. NAFTA was definitely in need of an update because it didn't have a lot of the new economy stuff. Like, it didn't have rules on digital trade or e-commerce, for instance. And so, because, in the mid-90s, when NAFTA was being signed, there was this little company called Amazon, and they were selling used books online, and they went public in 1997, right? So e-commerce wasn't really a thing then, but today it's the lifeblood of the global economy, right? Digital flows of information, financial transactions, and these agreements that we signed back in the 90s really all need to be updated now to account for, just the reality of our new modern economy. So that's one thing that USMCA did. And then that was a good thing. And then there are other things too that sort of took us a little bit backwards. The USMCA put some really strict rules in terms of the rules on auto production, with an eye on electric vehicles. So to keep North American auto trade free trade, countries had to commit to using more North American content, and Mexican had to commit to some labor laws. So that was a little bit of a backslide there in terms of the original intent of NAFTA in some people's eyes. But overall, I think it's fair to say that the e-commerce digital trade chapter and USMCA made it worth it.
So I have one last question for you before our actual last question. If you were the absolute ruler of the United States for a day on trade, maybe not everything, that's a lot. What reforms would you implement with respect to trade? Would you go for unilateral free trade, or would you start with low-hanging fruit, or I guess what would you do?
You mean in today's world?
Yep.
So you have to, I'd have to face the current situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a really hard question. As an economist, that's a really hard question, because obviously an obvious answer would be unilateral free trade. But then, of course, you give up a lot of your leverage, your negotiating leverage, right? Because there's a lot of things that we want other countries to do, but they will only do it if they get something from us, right? So we kind of have to we have to have some leverage, right? We have to keep some special cards in our back pocket that other countries will want. So, I think one thing I think has been pretty clear is the lack of effectiveness of industrial policy. So undoing some of these Buy American provisions that have been tacked on to some of these bigger efforts in terms of our infrastructure efforts, big bills on infrastructure, a lot of money going into computer chips, and the energy transition, I would claw back all those Buy America provisions and really focus on why we were doing it in the first place. And that usually gets you to the point of, just investing. Invest in infrastructure and in education and research and development, but don't try to micromanage, how U.S. companies and entities can do it.
I see. All right. So I have one last question for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to share and to talk to us about all of this. I've learned so much. What is one thing that you believed at one time in your life that you later changed your position on, and why?
That would be the reason for free trade, right? So the case for free trade, you can make a pretty strong efficiency case, right? I mean, the efficiency case for free trade is clear in terms of allocative efficiency, and I won't bore you with that. I mean, but that's all indisputable. But the reason to trade is, I've come to believe, it's not efficiency, right? It's that over time, each generation gets a chance to mold its skills to the dynamism of an economy that has trade, that's open to the world, right? And so if you don't do that, you get people stuck into these stagnant situations. But when you're open to goods and services and ideas and people from around the world, it encourages innovation, encourages human flourishing. And it's true, at any point in time, there will be people that struggle, right? Because that's just inevitable, whether it's from trade or technology. But the next generation, right, their children are going to do better, right? And then I guess the other big reason that I didn't see earlier was just that the alternative to free trade, right? The alternative to free trade is protectionism, it's favoritism, and you just end up with this activist trade policy where you are encouraging companies and trade associations to try to, seek special treatment. It's called rent seeking. They're trying to curry favor. So, even if we can't do the redistribution ideally, ensure there are going to be some winners and losers from trade and technology, but you still need to look at the counterfactual, right? And so we ultimately cannot protect every single American worker from global competition, right? But all we can do, though, is help write the rules that we believe in, and then you got to let people run the race.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest for their time and insight, and I'd like to thank you for listening to the Great Antidote podcast. The Great Antidote is sound engineered by Rich Goyette. If you have any questions, any guests or topic recommendations, please feel free to reach out to me at thegreatantidote@gmail.com. Thank you.